live, and I would like to welcome warmly to our session towards greater financial resilience, enhancing the global disaster risk finance architecture. Dear audience, distinguished panelists, thank you for coming. What is the benefit of disaster risk finance? And moreover, why do we need to enhance the global disaster risk finance architecture? Imagine, and I want to bring more tangibility to that, giving you an idea about risk finance and insurance. How would you drive a car without insurance? How would you manage your health without health insurance? Transferring your risk to a risk carrier can provide peace of mind. Many people in the world do not have this comfort and are thrown into poverty if climate change hits. More than 3 billion people are living in vulnerable conditions, according to the latest IPCC assessment report. And in these vulnerable countries, more than 90% of losses are not insured, leaving a huge protection gap. Under the Injury Resilience Global Partnership, the global multi-stakeholder partnership on climate and disaster risk finance and insurance, 24 programs in more than 100 countries and more than 300 projects have reached climate change protection for 150 million people in 2021. But this is not enough. More needs to be done. And in our panel session today, we will hear about the vision of Germany's G7 presidency on a global shield against climate risks. We will be understanding on the enhancement of climate and disaster risk finance, and we will identify key drivers for further enhancing the climate and disaster risk finance architecture. Before we come to this, we have prepared a little Mentimeter and a question. And I would like to ask, thank you, the technology to bring in and bring up the question and the link for the poll we are doing. So what is the first word and impression that comes into your mind when thinking about climate and disaster risk finance and insurance? Please now enter the link with the code and type in the first word, the first impression you have, what comes into your mind when thinking about climate and disaster risk finance. And we will see soon. Just I give you some minutes to type the words, and soon we will see a word cloud, hopefully, that shows your impression, your first idea, what comes in your mind. We give a little time to the technology to realize that and show the word cloud now, slowly. And yes, and right in the middle, the central issue is resilience. Increasing resilience is key. Loss and damage, we have this discussion, of course, carried throughout a different climate conference of the parties. And here comes more: compensation, vulnerability, insufficient funding. Yes, we are talking about this today. Recovery, inclusion, preparedness, very important. And stakeholders, we need all stakeholders, all sectors to be involved. Integrated approaches, risk pools, our regional instruments, for example. Pre-arranged, so pre-arranged finance, predictability. I think this is fantastic. It also kicks us off for a lively debate, I suppose, here. And I think we have brought up the major issues, major topics, key topics here through the audience. I thank you very much for this, and we can continue with the session. We have 5 fantastic and distinguished panelists with us who will be joining in the discussion. We have Heike Henn, Director for Climate, Energy and Environment at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Germany will kick us off with the vision of a global shield against climate risks, which will be followed by a discussion on the needs and experiences by Paula Alvarez, Assistant Secretary, Department of Finance, the Republic of the Philippines, Gernot Laganda, Chief and Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction Programs at UN World Food Programme, Vusita Vijayanayake, Executive Director of Slyken Trust, and after the discussion, Jorge Castellumendi, Director at the Adrian R. Rockefeller Foundation, Atlantic Council, and Race to Resilience, will provide us with an outlook to the COP27 and expectations on climate and disaster risk finance and insurance and the global shield. I would now like to hand over to Heike Henn from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, and to kick us off on the vision of Germany's G7 presidency. Heike Henn, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Astrid, and greetings from Germany, Berlin actually, and a very warm welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and I think also good evening to my fellow colleagues at the panel and the audience online in this somehow hybrid setting. Astrid, I mean, you already mentioned it in your introduction. The urgency of the climate crisis is visible. It is backed up what we see right now on floods in South Africa or drought in the Horn of Africa. It's backed up by science, by the latest IPCC reports, by data, and therefore it's really urgent that we not only talk about mitigation, but also about adaptation, resilience, and specifically strengthening our activities against climate risk. And therefore, it's a top priority of the German government, a top priority also of our G7 presidency. And specifically, we want to do more and see definitely the need to do more on climate risk financing. And I'm happy to have the chance to talk a bit about what we are doing right now already in the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership, but more specifically what we aim to do and get feedback from the panelists and the audience. And Astrid, you already mentioned the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership, also our host for today, where together with the G20, V20, and partners like our host also today, UNDRR, are working closely together to scale up the kind of solutions we need to address, tackle, and deal with, manage the climate and disaster risk. And our vision so far of the partnership is to reach 500 million people in climate vulnerable countries by 2025. And we are doing already a lot to enable more timely and reliable post-disaster risk response and to better prepare for climate and disaster risks. And definitely we need and want to reduce the humanitarian impacts of disasters, specifically for poor and vulnerable people, to enable them to recover more quickly, to not lose all their assets, to increase local adaptive capacity and really strengthen local resilience. You already mentioned, Astrid, all the good figures about the investment of G20 plus partners of more than 1.2 billion euros in total, but also the program in more than 100 countries already. And from a German perspective, we definitely link our engagement also with social protection nets, with anticipatory action that will also be scaled up in the years to come to 100 million euros. But we all, I think, agree that it's not enough. And not only in Glasgow, but also in Glasgow, we heard the calls from partner countries loud and clear that more needs to be done to protect poor and vulnerable countries and people. And therefore, we put it really as a high priority on our agenda of the G7 presidency. And we really aim to strengthen the climate and disaster risk financing architecture to be more systemic, more coherent, and more sustained. And that also addresses financing. And therefore, we hope to gradually develop a global shield against climate risks. And don't worry, I only have 2 slides. First slide is the vision, working together with all partners and stakeholders towards this global shield. And we want to make a difference in substance for vulnerable countries and people. And we want also to make a difference by bringing it into the discussions on loss and damages, making it a real and also high-level political discussion on solutions, real solutions for real people in vulnerable countries. And we aim to strengthen the climate and disaster risk finance architecture in 3 ways. Understanding risk and vulnerabilities to be then able to quantify the protection gap. That is a priority because only then can we address risk intelligently. Secondly, a smart management of risk and a scale up of premium and capital support is needed from our perspective for sustained financial protection. And the third element is collaboration instead of working in silos. That is definitely key to leverage the full potential of all the services that are already existing in the CDRFI landscape. And therefore, we propose to build upon the successes of the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership, but go beyond and add to that in then transferring or redesigning the CDRFI architecture to be more systemic and more coherent and more sustainable. Second slide, please. So how do we get there? How do we want to achieve this? We propose basically 3 things. We want to be comprehensive and go beyond insurance. It's a whole range of instruments and measures in the climate and disaster risk sphere, financing sphere. First, we propose to strengthen cooperation with establishing a central platform for a coordinated approach for global climate and disaster risk finance. Secondly, we seek to establish a truly global, flexible, and collaborative financing structure. And lastly, being aware of really the financial pressure that vulnerable countries face at the moment, and not only right now, but right now we look at multiple crises with the war against the Ukraine, with food crisis, energy crisis, Corona, climate crisis, and we definitely see the urgency to support also via premium financing. Premium financing and the provision of capital to risk carriers have already become an important tool to address affordability barriers and therefore help vulnerable countries. And in the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership, we developed a set of principles to enhance the impact of premium financing. And with G7 endorsement, we could contribute to really a more sustained protection in vulnerable countries. And I'm very happy to say that our proposal was very well received by the G7. Last week only, We had the G7 Development Ministerial in Berlin, where the G7 together agreed on working towards a shield and endorsed the 3 elements we proposed, and I just presented briefly. You can find a bit more information in the Development Ministers' communique. And this means that we now have the mandate to continue our work towards the global shield up to the G7 summit, but way beyond, up to COP27 as well. And we hope to be able to present more concrete information on substance and concrete progress soon. And while working on the global shield, various stakeholders shared important insights with us. Most importantly, we have been engaging with the countries most affected, listening to their needs, their expectations on what a global shield needs to offer, and talking also to civil society and others. And I'm looking forward to learn more also today from your views and learn more also from your questions. Thank you very much for your attention, and over to you, Astrid.
Thank you very much for this fantastic overview. And first of all, let me congratulate to you for this very good and great milestone you have reached with the G7 Development Ministers' mandate to the Global Shield. You mentioned that it's so important to have funding, to have the right solutions, to have collaboration. And especially you mentioned the inclusiveness of this discussion with the V20 group, the most vulnerable countries. We have the honor to have a representative of the Philippines, of also one of the countries that is strongly hit by disaster. Just recently with Typhoon Rai in the December 21, there's a lot of really climate change impact coming, and the Philippines are also known that you have a very elaborate climate and disaster risk finance approach already in place. You are among the vulnerable countries known as pioneering here with a more strategic approach. Yet you see a lot of damages are still occurring, a lot of losses are there, and also the protection gap is still huge. So learning from this new vision and seeing this new vision, the global shield for closing the protection gap, and thinking and reflecting on your experiences in the Philippines, what challenges do you encounter in a vulnerable country when trying to scale up solutions? Is it the funding? Is it the collaboration? I mean, observations, what would help you best under this global shield? And please, Assistant Secretary Paola Alvarez, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Astrid. And first of all, we thank Germany as the leader of the G7 for announcing its commitment and the approval of the G7 for the Global Shield elements. So briefly, in the Philippines, we always say that climate change and disaster risks do not work in silos. So for us, it is a spectrum. On the one hand, for the Ministry of Finance, we do recognize that we need to mobilize financing for adaptation and mitigation, most especially to help the vulnerable communities adapt to the changing climate. However, at the same time, while we need to mobilize financing for adaptation, disaster risks is happening in real time. So recently, we have seen the different intensifying weather and the different, the changing patterns of weather. So in 2020, 2021, and in 2022, super typhoons have become the normal. And our weather patterns are also changing. So recently, our weather station announced that May officially started the rainy season, when previously May was summertime. So in trying to address both how to mobilize financing for disaster risks and adaptation, I think the most common issues that we face is firstly the legal frameworks. So how do we efficiently mobilize finance as a means for disaster protection? Second is accessibility. Since the Philippines is a highly vulnerable country, our climate and disaster risk exposure is quite high. So as the climate change exacerbates the risks exposure of the Philippines, so does the premium costs. And since the most vulnerable people are the most at risk, it is very hard for them to actually access financing, especially for the premium. So smart capital and premium support is really a very good solution that we could explore, especially for V20 countries. So putting things in perspective, as a vulnerable country, we're trying to emerge from an economic recession. So the pandemic hit a lot of economies across the globe. However, V20 countries are the most that are suffering because number one, we are emerging economies. Number two, we are highly vulnerable. So even with the pandemic, we still have to face the different typhoons. So as we were mobilizing finance during the pandemic for subsidies, for vaccines, we were also being hit by typhoons. So in our internal budget, although we allocate funds for disasters and other emergency needs, these funds were reallocated for the COVID pandemic. And while we were mobilizing finance for the pandemic, we still had to look for other drawdown facilities and solutions to address our disaster risk exposure and damages. So the increasing debt burden, the increasing strain to fiscal space, as well as the development challenges that are posed by disaster risks is also increasing. So we think it is very timely that we come up with solutions, not just in the financing area, with how to mobilize finance, how to provide premium subsidy, but at the same time, the architecture of how do we structure risk sharing? How do we make microfinance more accessible, not just for the most vulnerable, but also for the micro, small, and medium enterprises? Because when Typhoon Haiyan hit, one of the worst typhoons in the Philippines, a study made showed that those with microfinance were actually the most that were able to bounce back from the devastation brought about by the disaster. So it's been proven that because it is more accessible, because it is more easier to deploy, microfinance is another means for us to help cushion the effects for the growing intensity of disasters. So aside from that, maybe peer-to-peer learning, because as we also sit as chair with Barbados in the V20 for risks exposure, one of the things that we saw is that not all countries are in the same page in terms of capacity and in terms of the sophistication of the different legal structures that are related to climate and disaster risks. So what we see that could help is how do we help peers, like through peer exchange, learn from each other. What is another neighboring country doing in terms of disaster risks, so that when we approach disasters as a region or as a group of vulnerable people, then we could have solutions that are tried and tested or something that is doable across borders. So maybe I'll leave it there. Thank you, Astrid.
Thank you very much, Assistant Secretary Alvarez. I think you gave a wonderful overview and ideas for refining the work in the Global Shield. You mentioned the peer-to-peer learning, but also, and I found this interesting with regard to this kind of comprehensive approach, not only at the governmental level, but also at the individual level. The micro insurance, for example, is complementary and is needed for a more comprehensive strategy against climate risks. And then also the topic of the small fiscal range due to the compounding risks that we have seen over the past years. I mean, that's already a lot of additional great ideas. I would like to come now to Gernot Laganda from the World Food Programme. Because the World Food Programme is quite active in this area, combining also the implementation here of disaster risk finance with the humanitarian sphere, but also I think it is important to look at a key sector, namely the food supply. And we know that World Food Programme has quite some programs out, and we are keen to learn where do you see the benefit of climate and disaster risk finance and insurance, and why should we embark on that more stronger in terms of an enhanced architecture?
Thank you very much, Astrid, for the kind introduction, the kind invite. Thank you to Germany for the leadership in this important space. And also to Paola Alvarez for, I think, sharing a really strong perspective of a government on the issue. I'm going to bring a slightly more humanitarian angle, so the perspective from an agency that is providing humanitarian aid, food assistance to around 120 million people every year, and try to contextualize a little bit why climate risk financing is important in this space. You know, when you look at the world today, when you open your CNN feed, you see that the hunger problem in the world is really as bad as it has ever been in the 21st century. We're talking about basically a doubling of the number of people who are in a food crisis or emergency over the course of only 2 years. And there are 3 drivers behind this trend. There is climate extremes, there are conflicts, and there are costs. So there are economic shocks, economic disruptions, especially now, that basically ripple through the globe, also in the wake of big conflicts such as the one in Ukraine. So now you have this interplay between different factors, and that hits many people and many countries unprepared. So you see food systems break down all over the world. We're talking about 39 countries where you now have people in a food emergency in life-threatening situations, around 48 million people in life-threatening situations in 39 countries, as many as we've ever had over the past decade. So this is one factor. The second factor, though, that is really very important, and this is where this conversation comes in, there is a lack of protection of people. So basically shocks can only lead to disasters if they interact with vulnerable conditions. And vulnerability in countries is usually a multidimensional affair. You know, you have lack of access to natural resources, you have lack of access to information, you have lack of access to technology, lack of access to financial services. And in this particular spectrum, I think risk financing plays a very, very important role. Very often when you look into resilience programs or disaster risk reduction programs, there's a strong reliance on nature-based protection or other aspects. So these projects generally do a very, very good job addressing one driver or one deficiency in people's resilience, but without financial protection, there's really something very important missing. No, when people, we have just in the previous panel, the colleague from the Ministry of Disaster Management in South Sudan said, as soon as shocks displace people, they require wood in order to reinforce their shelters. So if you plant trees now, and you do not have any financial protection for people, they rely basically on the free resources in the landscapes. Very often, you know, firewood, and that is then also very important for disaster protection. So there's this vicious cycle. So when we look now at disaster risk financing and how it looks like in practice, then in the context of WFP, we have 3 ways in which disaster risk financing works. The very first one is probably what you would call the traditional, conventional humanitarian approach. This is financing of losses and damages after they have happened. So this is loss financing. This is the most expensive and probably least empowering approach, because people are already in an emergency situation and they are dependent on basically handouts in order to make it through that difficult period. The second way, the second option to finance disaster risk is anticipatory action. That means working with solid forecasts of hazards be it droughts, storms, or floods, to then trigger support, preventive action before the hazard turns into a disaster. This kind of action can never reduce the impact of these hazards down to zero, but it can substantively mitigate their impact and reduce basically then also the costs of the humanitarian operations substantively. For example, in Bangladesh in 2020, the international community, together with the government, building on the government's early warning system, has transferred around $54 per family to around 30,000 families 4 days before a flood hit vulnerable communities along the Jamuna River. And when you then look into the impact analysis, then you see that around a third of the families have not been hungry throughout the duration of the flood. You see that the cash has basically reached people 4 days earlier than it would have, up to 100 days earlier than conventional humanitarian aid, because when everything is flooded, you have no access to markets, right? When you get the money 4 days before, you can still stock up on food, on supplies, and other things, and it has reduced the costs of the humanitarian operation by half. So that's the second option. And the third option for us is risk sharing or insurance. This is basically the work that also, as Astrid has mentioned, goes on two parallel rails. There is microinsurance, where smallholder farmers are the insurance policy holders. And then there is sovereign insurance, where governments are the policy holders or humanitarian agencies purchase this policy. And here there is an example in WFP that is called the African Risk Capacity Replica Program. The African Risk Capacity is an institution by the African Union that basically pools the risk of different countries into one pool of risks that then basically pays out if you have a certain index, a certain trigger metric being reached. And humanitarian agencies such as WFP or the START network of NGOs, they can replicate this kind of insurance. That means they can also buy from the African Risk Capacity Limited, which is the insurance company, a policy. And the advantage of this twinning is that in negotiating the product together and in establishing the contingency plan, what happens if there is a payout, who does what, who does food distributions, who does supplementary feeding programs, who distributes cash, there is this efficiency, this contingency planning that is really very necessary. So last year, when I look into the latest reports, 5 countries were covered. In 3 countries, there was a trigger, and there were $9.4 million of payouts in Mali, Mauritania, and Burkina Faso. So basically, support was delivered to 250,000 people through that risk financing instrument. And again, when a trigger of such a program hits, then usually it hits earlier than the process where you have to first account for the needs. You need to assess the needs, then you need to raise an appeal, you need to go around and raise money, and then basically the aid only comes later. So there is a time efficiency and there is an efficiency in terms of the money coming from a private sector instruments. So I think this is pretty much what I would like to say. It's, I think at the moment, the good news really is that these instruments, they are proven to work, right? So we have examples, we have the economics, we have return on investment analysis. The bad news is that at the moment, they are not at the scale where they should be or where they could be. So this is why an initiative such as the Global Shield for us is really important, because I think it catalyzes the partnerships that are necessary between private sector, governments, humanitarian institutions, development institutions, to put a bit of, I would say, coordination behind things such as insurance subsidies, which will again pop up in COP27 as an issue around loss and damage. So there is this relevance here between this conversation and the loss and damage conversation, also at the COP27. But overall, I hope I have had an opportunity to share a little bit with you why climate risk financing is also over the long term, which is, and that money is scarce, right? So at the moment, still we have a 50% financing gap between all the humanitarian needs out there and basically the funding that is available. So humanitarian money is not ad infinitum available to help everybody who is in need. So these are the types of instruments that can help us increase the efficiency in the international aid architecture. Thank you. Back over to you, Astrid.
Thank you, Gernot, and very amazing the numbers you have stated. But also what struck me most was that you said action after loss has happened is most expensive. And also the timing issue, I think, is important here. So to shift from crisis management to risk management, I think, is really the goal we have, and to reinforce that action under such a global effort, a reinforced kind of effort through the Global Shield, I think is very much needed. Let me come to another perspective here, namely the civil society. And we have the honor to have Vozita Vigenayake with us from Slack and Trust. And I would like to ask Vozita, now we see a very fragmented landscape as well of actors. There's a lot of good examples out, good action, good solutions, like the ones Gernot has mentioned from the World Food Programme. But where do you see, Vozita, where do you see how can the civil society organizations help? What role can they play? And also other stakeholders here to support here that this action scales up.
Thank you, Astrid. Thank you for the opportunity, and it's great to hear from all the speakers different perspectives on how climate and disaster risk could scale up resilience building. Just to introduce myself, I work as the Executive Director of Slack and Trust, which is a nonprofit think tank. We are based in Sri Lanka and in Germany, and we are also working in Africa and Asia as our primary focus, as well as in Europe on policy-related work. Our primary focus is developing countries, how we could contribute to resilience building, to climate and disaster, and inclusive and participatory processes. So just to bring in how civil society could play a role, we have different civil societies, we focus on different thematic aspects and actions, and we work with communities, the vulnerable communities, as well as policy processes. So one key role that the civil society could play is connecting the dots and engaging vulnerable groups as well as multiple other actors to processes related to climate and disaster risk, and also especially risk financing, and how the policy processes could be more inclusive and participatory, bringing in evidence and impact, how accountability could be raised, as well as inclusion of vulnerable communities, for example, smallholder farmers, fishing community, youth, women and migrants potentially, depending on the country context of what is the vulnerability, what is the risk that people are facing. Additionally, something that we've identified in our work is that there are a lot of gaps in risk assessments, identification of risk that different communities as well as countries are facing, plus technical gaps that exist in addressing this. So civil society and other different actors through multiple partnerships could contribute to addressing these gaps. And also solutions that are being proposed could be inclusive through different actors playing a role, which is within their mandate. So for example, the countries and the government authorities leading the processes, identifying what's country context based and what are the solutions. And those other actors, for example, civil society, academia, private sector, contributing to these processes that are country-driven, contextualized, and not applied through like a default mechanism. So evidence-based actions that are context-based, identify the priorities of countries which need to be addressed, as well as building on existing baselines. So for example, in Sri Lanka that we work primarily on this pilot phases of insurance. We've identified the existing mechanisms that are there, for example, a crop insurance that's been there for close to 70 years, and which has a focus on disasters, floods, droughts, and this is funded by the government. So building on these existing processes and scaling them up and not duplicating the processes, but building on these and providing support, means of implementation, technical expertise to scale up what's there, and also identifying what might need to be introduced through a discussion with different actors at local level as well as national, and feeding into global processes would build resilience. I want to also make a point about the impacts component. I think Insurance Global Partnership is working on this as a primary focus as well. How evidence being strengthened, how different actors focusing on indicators that are identified, which would help assess the progress that's being made, the impact that's being made, would help to ensure that the actions are done in a way that's scaling up resilience and can be measured, so that we could indicate the means of implementation that's included in the processes are having impact that's scaled up from the baseline to what it is. One more thing, the indicators also combining with existing vulnerabilities. We are speaking about disasters and climate impacts, but in country context, there might be a lot of vulnerabilities that we're facing. So these need to be understood and contextualized in taking action. I'll come to other things when I have another chance. Thank you, Astrid.
Thank you very much, Rosita. I think these are very important points, and it's a fantastic segue to the next question I have to the panelists, because Rosita, you mentioned to connect various actors, but also not at a global level, but also at country level, to identify the needs of the country, especially, and understand the risks, the particular risks better, to gather and convene the parties in a country and build on existing processes, not duplicating efforts. That's absolutely key, I think. And that brings me to the next question, which I would like to pose to some of the panelists. I think looking at the Global Shield, we have, when listening to Heike Henn, I would like your perspective on what would make a Global Shield successful, and looking at Assistant Secretary Paola Alvarez first. You already had brought in some key issues, but how could this Global Shield now be successfully launched and supportive for a country like the Philippines? What are the key ingredients?
Thank you, Astrid. So from the Philippines perspective, since we already developed numerous types of disaster risk and finance insurance strategies, what we think is very essential in creating an effective global shield is how to have a centralized mechanism for adaptation and resilience. So what we mean by this is not just incorporating avenues or windows for premium support for the most vulnerable who cannot afford it, but to enable the environment to create policies, for example, for prearranged and affordable effective disaster risk and finance solutions, and how to create, for example, risk pooling mechanisms or other ways to lower the cost of insurance premiums. So aside from this, maybe we could look into how the architecture, like the global architecture, can complement regional and other international platforms that also address disaster risk finance and insurance. So maybe looking at how other countries in the G7 started to create their own national risk registry systems. We think that for vulnerable countries, how to develop effective national risk registry systems would be very helpful for anticipatory action, because not just for mobilizing pre-need finance, but to adequately address, how much insurance you need to cover what types of perils, and for us to also properly gauge how much should the premium cost be. So the price of insurance is the most basic, but the enabling environment to create insurance more affordable and to lessen the risk just in one region and to create sovereign risk pools is also an avenue for the Global Shield to be more effective. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that was very concrete. I come back to you, Rosita, because you suggested kind of trying to connect the actors. Can you bring already some more concrete ideas for the Shield now? What could be done here? And especially when we talk about the national level.
Yeah, thank you, Astrid. Yeah, so something that would be good is to ensure that when the processes are introduced, that civil society, the community at local level as well as national level are not ignored, and whatever the work that they've been doing could contribute to the processes. So it's important that there's an understanding of who's playing a role in country as well as local level, so that what is happening could be built on to scale up activity that's in the country. So for example, if I may take the multi-actor partnership project that we are part of, which has in Africa as well as in Asia, a lot of members, and also in the Caribbean. There are different actors working with the governments, with the private sector, as well as civil society and academia, to identify the baselines, also create processes that are inclusive. So these could be baselines to build on when you have the Shield introduced. Additionally, identifying evidence that's already there, because we need to contextualize what's being done and the existing vulnerabilities that's in the country, and this could be a resource base. I think most of the research that's happened through the multi-actor partnerships have been documented, case studies, and creating an opportunity for those actors to showcase the good practices and feeding them in. Maybe finding opportunities to have entry points for these to be included in the policy processes, as well as not necessarily just national, but the means of implementation that's addressed, linking with the good practices and replicating them cross countries. That would be an opportunity as well. Yeah, I'll stop at that, and also civil society and community and the sectors that are most vulnerable being prioritized would be very important. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosita. And now over to Gernot from the World Food Programme. What, from your experiences, where would you see elements and key issues for the Global Shield?
Two comments.
Hear you. Now we can hear you. Sorry.
You can.
Fine. All is fine.
Okay. Okay. 2 comments. I think the issue is very urgent, right? So we are still working under the assumption that the 1.5-degree target we have under the Paris Agreement, we're gonna blow past that in the next, 10 to 15 years. So I don't think we have a lot of time to protect people. So I think we need to start building on what's already available. I think regional risk pools are a really good entry point. You have not only the African risk capacity, but you have the CRIF, you have the Pacific risk pools. So there are instruments out there that are already well, I think, acquainted with the risk profiles in different world regions, and they know the risk profiles of different countries. So I think this is something to build on. I also think there is a very good connectivity with social protection systems. In the Caribbean, for example, we have a pilot where we try to pay a top up to the insurance that the government is taking out. And then when there is a payout, the insurance payout goes through the national social protection system and thereby makes that social protection system shock responsive, because that payout then goes to those households that are hit in the most vulnerable places. So there is, I think, a very strong debate already about social protection, and insurance mechanisms, risk financing mechanisms can be a very good complement, I think, to national social protection systems, and even strengthen those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gernot. I think that's very helpful as well. And let me. I see there are interesting questions already coming in from the audience. We'll come to that soon. But let me have a third round of questions quickly. Just a short answer of yours, and then I would like to open the floor for discussion. Now more in concrete, how can you and your institution work together in the Global Shield to accelerate action for and with the vulnerable countries and communities? And where do you see your role to contribute to the Shield? And basically, I would like to start with Rosita, with you, because I think there is a strong role for the civil society organizations, and especially also at country level. So please, Rosita.
Yeah, so I think shortest way would be linking local, national, and global on how the stories of the vulnerable communities would be brought to the national level. And I mean, stories in the sense of priorities and the needs, and then connected to the global level. And also evidence-based solutions that would be based on research from the ground, interlinked with policy through documentation that could happen for inclusive and participatory processes. Yeah.
Thank you, Rosita, and we'll come back to you on that, certainly. And you're representing in the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership in the high-level consultative group, the civil society organization. So that's for sure that we will collaborate here strongly. Then I also would like Paola, from the perspective of a country, what do you think in the Philippines you could do and contribute to the Global Shield from your perspective?
Yes, thank you, Astrid. So from the Philippines perspective, we do recognize that there are already a lot of initiatives going on in the sphere of disaster protection and climate change. So maybe what we think would be more beneficial is a coordinated approach. Maybe when the G20 and the G7 discussions start, maybe representation from the V20 to ensure that the work streams take into consideration what the other groupings are also working on, as well as, for example, to include perspectives from the APEC or the ASEAN, because all of these intergovernmental panels seek the same thing. And for us to streamline the work stream and how representation is done, I think would be very beneficial, not only for the members, but also for the movement of the initiatives forward. So thank you.
Thank you. That's very important. And this also calls for a strong representation in the Global Shield of the V20, of the vulnerable countries. And of course, we count also on your strong voice here and support. Thank you. And Gernot, from the World Food Programme, what and how could the World Food Programme contribute to the Global Shield?
Three things I think are important here. The first one is I think we can work with governments to conserve scarce humanitarian funding. So there is usually whenever things happen, you know, there's never enough funding to go around to reach everyone in need. And basically bringing these instruments into play, combining them with our risk absorption capabilities is very important. The second aspect is we can help reach people that are in very remote, difficult places and that are normally not the typical clients for financial service provision in least developed countries, in countries where you have fragility. So basically the reach deep into the field. And the third point is, I think, scalability. Building on what's already there, when you look at last year's numbers, we have around 2.7 million people protected with climate risk insurance mechanisms. I think very easy to double that in the next 1 to 2 years if we work in coordination with partners. So scalability, building on what's already there. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very important and brings me directly to the perspective of a donor country. And we have Heike Henn representing Germany here, scalability and Germany. What is the contribution from the donor's perspective here?
Thank you very much, Astrid. I hope I don't get kicked out technically now, but if so, I will get in soon. But thank you very much. I think I heard so many great aspects mentioned by the colleagues on the panel from the different perspectives that are highly relevant for the way forward for the Global Shield. So really, thank you so much for sharing. And I think if you ask specifically for Germany, I think, okay, right now we have a leadership role within G7 and we want to make the most of it politically to really leverage support. That is A, on the political level. Then B, I think the different aspects that were mentioned by colleagues and that are highly relevant, like having a joint perspective, a joint effort, really an inclusive setup, having a multi-stakeholder approach, local level, civil society, bringing all different actors, private sector, humanitarian sphere in, and having it led by country and country ownership and really a spirit of cooperation. I think this involves for us, Germany, but maybe for also others on the call, really a different mindset. Because somebody was mentioning the silos, I think it was Paula from the Philippines, and we have to change definitely our mindset. And sometimes it seems to be easier to work in silos instead of reaching out to others, also challenging our way of thinking and doing things. And I think this is really something that we internally in our processes want to make differently in the future. And of course, we definitely think we have to put finance on the table. Germany already, BMZ, is engaged a lot in insurance, into resilience, but way beyond. Gernot mentioned
Unfortunately, we have some technical problems. I need to jump in now. We cannot hear. We cannot hear you very well, Heike. So I think the connection will not get better. Maybe we can.
Sorry, was I gone and you couldn't hear me?
You were gone and we couldn't hear you. We have you in double, so maybe we can mute one and we have to jump live in.
I don't know if you heard everything or when did I break off?
You broke off with the finance part, and then we had no good connection anymore.
Oh, sorry. Just briefly, it was my last point, and sorry for the technical hiccups. I don't know what happens in Berlin right now. But the finance part is also an important one. So I would repeat what I said in the interest of maybe listeners. Because we need political will, we need to work in a more coordinated way, we need to bring all actors together, but definitely we also need more finance on the table. And we, as from the German side, are active in along the whole spectrum, from early warning until the humanitarian sphere, but with insurance, with prearranged finance, with social protection, adaptive social protection nets. But we aim to increase our financing for resilience and for losses and damages. And we try to mobilize the political will of others. And I think if we jointly are successful in an inclusive...
Recording in progress.
In an inclusive approach to redesign the architecture to be more efficient and effective, I think then it will be also easier to mobilize funding from other donors, but also from the private sector, from philanthropies. And I think this is something where we want to use our G7 leverage and make more progress and support it also with our own financing from Germany. Thank you, and over, Astrid. And sorry again for the hiccup.
No problem. We heard you loud and clear with the important message on also mobilizing further support and further political will, but also finance from others. And I think that's very important. And that goes at the same time along with a very well crafted structure of climate and disaster risk finance and insurance at a global level. And here we go. I mean, there's so many questions coming in. I see it at my screen, but we also have questions from the audience on site in Bali. And here we also, I would like to really open the floor for the questions now. And now with the support on site from my colleague Delia, we may get some of the questions of the audience in. So can I reach out on site, Delia, on the ground live? Do I hear some signal from the floor? Otherwise, I would kickstart with a question which I see here on the screen, just to get a signal from the audience. No, not yet. So I would try to continue. There is a first question, and in fact, it's to you, Heike. A very first question, and it maybe also would touch a little bit on what Rosita could answer here. How to set and monitor global shield element with gender responsive indicator? So how can we enter a kind of a gender dimension into the global shield? So maybe Heike and maybe also Rosita. Who wants first? Heike, yes.
No, I was open just, but thank you so much for the question. I think this goes straight into the key question about vulnerabilities. What are the most vulnerable countries, the protection gaps, but also what are the most vulnerable groups, people in country. And therefore, to have a better understanding and disaggregated aggregated data, that is very important for us. You might know that with after our elections, we have now also a government that is promoting a feminist development policy. And therefore, for us, this will certainly be something that we try to integrate into the architecture. So thank you very much for flagging that.
Maybe Rosita, you want to add?
Yes, thank you. On the indicator aspect on gender responsive action, I think there are processes that are already there that we could build on, that all countries will be working on, especially the DR ones. The Sendai framework could be one that we identify indicators or data through, as well as NDCs and SDGs, because some countries are already working on localized SDG indicators. So this could be something we could build on, as well as data processes that are already there. And there could also be already policies on entrepreneurship, gender responsive actions in country that can be also entry points to build this. I also want to mention the impacts framework, the working group work of IGP, which I co-lead as well, where there are indicators that are being developed, work that's happening through different actors. And this could be a framework that can contribute to this process to ensure gender responsive climate and disaster risk financing. And all the other evidence that's out there, not necessarily just these, but also the research community, civil society that has done case studies or processes that could measure climate and disaster risk resilience building. So we need to look at all these and contextualize it and apply it at country level and local level.
Thank you very much, Musita. And I think it's certainly a task that the Center of Excellence on Gender Smart Solutions of the Inter-Resilience Global Partnership has to work on here to make sure that this is well integrated into the Global Shield's work. We have more questions, and I know that we have to be patient when we receive questions from the audience, but in between, I have a question for Gernot here. From our colleague Kai here. He says, great to hear your thoughts on anticipatory finance and the effectiveness of insurance. I'd be interested to hear more about the examples you gave of Mali, Mauritania, and Burkina Faso. Gernot, are you ready to take that?
Yeah, Astrid, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay. Can I make a quick suggestion, because we have a number of hands up here in the audience, and I'm happy to address the question, but maybe we can run an extra loop here with our colleagues in the room, if you don't mind.
I'm happy to do so with your support. Let's run the questions from the floor and take them.
So thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for this really exciting panel. My name is Alexandra Rüth. I work for German Red Cross, and really very informative. And we all welcome the Global Shield. I think it's an extremely good idea and very important to really bring more financing to the table. You know that German Red Cross is working a lot and driving the anticipatory action agenda jointly with a lot of different partners such as WFP, and Gernot mentioned anticipatory action. I just have two questions or two concerns. So the first one is, will civil society actors and local actors have access to funding through the Global Shield and be involved in implementing actions on the ground? And then it seems to me, without knowing all the details, that it looks still like a very centralized management of the funds. So how can you ensure that there will be not a blockage of fund and the funding will be able to be released at time to make a real difference on the ground? Thanks so much. Very interesting.
And I think that's a direct question also to Heike on the financial vehicle, on the financial element of the Global Shield. If we have still a connection with you, Heike. I don't think we have, but yeah, I think she's trying to dial in again. Meanwhile, now we can see you, Heike, and I think this was a question to you. Would you like to take it?
Thank you very much, Astrid. Due to my technical problems here, I only heard the first part about access for civil society and local actors. And definitely, when I mentioned a financing structure that is very flexible and open for all kind of mechanisms, we were specifically also thinking about having possibility to get funds also out to local society, civil society, including local actors. So this is really something that we have in mind, and that is important to address the protection gaps from the best solution, the more efficient and effective solution to close the gaps, and not be limited because we can only channel funds via A or B. And therefore, we specifically aim to have this flexibility built in the financial structure.
Thank you very much. I think we can take another question from the audience. Meanwhile, in the Q&As, there are some questions also being addressed, but please post your questions in the Q&A section when you're online. And I see a hand up from the audience. Yes, the lady here, please, with the microphone. We cannot hear the microphone. Can you help us now?
Oh, okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I have a question for WFP. WFP was saying that, one of the main, action they are going to take is to ensure that, they reach the kind of last mile, the really far off vulnerable populations. So I'm wondering that, millions of people across the world, they are out of social protection, social safety net. So, and most of these are also the traditionally marginalized people. So what's the WFP strategy and the, good practices? Can this be, made possible?
Thank you. Social protection systems around the world take very different shapes and they have different quality. Some countries are just starting to build them, others have them already fully operational, and others have certain technical issues. For example, how do you reach, like you have just mentioned, people who are in very remote places, hard to reach, or they do not have a mobile phone, so you cannot use mobile payments. So there, basically in the humanitarian sector, we have a certain comparative advantage because we have contacts to many of the people in the remote and food insecure places that are sometimes disconnected from social services, from these instruments. And we can start basically by connecting them first through alternative means, which could be a cash-based transfer in coordination with the government in through a local outlet, or we use our own feeding centers, or we use local schools as distribution points. So this is basically bringing the last mile closer to these systems. And then of course there is also this aspect of beneficiary registration, which we use in a humanitarian context. But when you want to build up a social protection system, you require exactly that skill. You need to know where people live. You have in many places also internally displaced populations. So you need to understand a little bit the social fabric of your country. And this is basically a skill that I think the humanitarian sector, WFP, but also UNICEF and other colleagues can help a government to achieve. So this is then basically context specific what we do, but from the very basic, bringing the most remote and most disconnected closer to social protection systems, to then building the systems themselves. There's basically examples in different countries, and I'm happy to share those also bilaterally.
Thank you, Gernot. And I think this again calls for a very good and strong collaboration at a local level, at the country level, and also bringing the right actors together. We would take another question from the audience. And I think then, let's see who else is in the audience. I saw another hand up from the audience before when the camera was shifting. So is there another question from the audience?
Yes, there is.
Yes.
My name is Jemima Maina from the Kenya Red Cross. And in Kenya, we've really had great progress in terms of anticipatory action. And my question is around the financing part. And one of the key things that we've noted is within the Kenya Red Cross, we already have access to financing to support anticipatory action. But with our counterparts from the government, we still have challenges, given that even within the government system, they have put aside 2% of the government finances to support climate and disasters, but we are not able to access it for anticipatory action. And this is because of the policies and the legal frameworks. Additionally, insurance, there is very low uptake in Kenya. It has been piloted through government and non-state actors, but still we are having challenges at community level, and it's as a result of maybe cultural, religion, or the cost of the policy. So my question and for the Global Shield is, what is the role of research to understand what we can do better in terms of accessing the different financial instruments that are available at international level, national level, but also in countries such as Kenya, where we also have financial availability of funds at subnational level to support anticipatory action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to ask Heike Henn whether you would be ready to take that question.
Yeah, thank you, Astrid and colleagues. I can try to start to give an answer, because I think the colleague from the Red Cross in Kenya also touched upon a couple of important points, and it really comes down to the specific situation in country, not only regarding the risk, but also regarding the gaps and the means jointly to address those gaps. And part of the architecture that we promote or propose is definitely also a thorough climate risk analysis. Sometimes in countries it exists, so bring in analysis where it is needed, and build on the existing analysis if it's there. Bring in also additional capacity to analyze or to do a sort of a mapping to see where are maybe challenges also to access certain funds or to implement certain instruments. And regional risk pools were already mentioned by Gernot, and specifically also African risk capacity. And I think the colleagues there, supported by Germany and others, are also doing a lot, reaching out to African partners, African countries, to build capacity and to inform about the concept also of insurance. And I think the same is definitely needed for anticipatory financing. And therefore, I think it would definitely be necessary in a country-focused approach that the Global Shield has, to look in very concrete terms and to address the challenges that the colleague from the Red Cross was mentioning.
Thank you very much, Heike. And there's so many questions coming in. I would suggest, as time is running, and I would like to come to the next part of our session, that you pose the questions also to the Injury Resilience Secretariat if there are more issues coming up. Happy to respond with my team to that. But now we need to go ahead, and yeah, I mean, thank you very much for this discussion points, for the questions, for the reflection here. But we are also looking ahead. We are looking ahead to a COP that is coming up, particularly on adaptation and resilience. And we have the honor here to have Jorge Castellumendi here in our panel. And Jorge, you're also not only working for the Rockefeller Foundation, but also with Race to Resilience. You're working and supporting the climate champions, preparing the COP27, and much more. So you probably have listened now to all the discussion points, and have endured not to be able to talk yet, but now it's the right time, I think, for you to get in, for us to give us an outlook on the broader resilience adaptation agenda in the upcoming COP, how to link our discussion on the Global Shield to the COP's agenda? What expectations are coming up for the COP, and what can climate and disaster risk finance and insurance and the global architecture do? And how are the climate champions taking this topic up? I would like to hand over to you, Jorge.
Astrid, many thanks, and thanks for the invitation again. So yes, you're right. I've seen this great contributions from this excellent panel. It's been great conversation, and the most important, I would say, is the concreteness and the specifics of actions, that are more than ever required. I think that the COP27, as you said before, is seen as an adaptation COP. I would say that from now on, all the COPs are going to be adaptation COPs, and should be seen like that. I think we have an urgency and an ambition that we cannot just leave aside. The Egyptian presidency is putting a lot of emphasis on this COP being a COP not of announcements, but of actions. And I think that this is very much welcome on this space, and the conversation we had today actually signals to that we don't have any time left now. So that, as you said before, in addition to being part of the Atlantic Council, I'm part of the UN High-Level Climate Champions. And under the leadership of the Egypt champion, Mahmoud Mohildin, and the UK champion, Nigel Topping, they are conducting 3 processes that I think will render a lot of solutions from non-state actors. Non-state actors being a shorthand for private sector, civil society, local governments, community organizations, by COP27. So let me go to the specifics, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'll just, make sure that, whatever I'm sharing here could be then follow up via email. I'll share my email afterwards. So the first is a loss and damage dialogue with non-state actors. This was launched actually this week, and it's a listening and learning process to better understand the actions that non-state actors are already doing to address loss and damage. Several of these actions are being done by risk resilience partners. The Insurance Resilience Global Partnership is one of the partners to the risk resilience. And the idea is that we can buy not only the intersessionals now in Bonn in a month's time, but also by COP27, we showcase the concrete actions that the civil non-state actors are doing on loss and damage, and open up a dialogue that goes beyond political dialogue and more action-oriented. The second is, and this is not a silver bullet, it's been said already, insurance is not a silver bullet, but there is a specific focus on insurance that the champions would like to take for COP27. How? They want to showcase by the COP a handful of shovel-ready projects and interventions that have the potential to benefit urban, coastal, and rural vulnerable communities, where insurance approaches have the potential to provide financial viability and scalability to those projects. So they're not creating the wheel, but we would like to elevate efforts that you, Astrid, at the partnership are doing, but also other actors, and bring them to the surface at COP27. This effort is managed by the Atlantic Council, and we are coalescing the insurance industry. So we're bringing to the table a lot of private sector actors, but also relevant CDRIF actors to twin interventions with insurance industry. And this effort aims to advance insurance not as a silver bullet, not as a commercial product only, but as a risk management approach for risk identification and assessment, risk allocation, risk transfer, and residual risk determination for public assets and public goods. And finally, and I will stop there in the benefit of the panel, the COP27 Resilience Hub. This is a physical and virtual hub along with a set of regional hubs that will happen at COP. This is the second year. This is a collaboration between the champions, UNFCCC, the Global Resilience Partnership, Resilience Rising, and the Atlantic Council. And this year, CDRFI would be one of the key programmatic pillars for the hub, the upcoming COP. So, as I said before, I'll share my email. If anybody's interested in connecting on this, happy to do that. One last point that I'll make is the Global Shield is so welcoming news. One thing that the champions would love to work more with the Global Shield is to understanding better the protection gap for a specific urban, coastal, and rural community. So go to the level not only of sovereign, but also going in understanding which communities in which countries, what are they already have as protection and what are they missing, so we can better attend that and connect the non-state actors from our risk resilience into those actions. So thank you so much for the opportunity again.
Thank you so much, Jorge. That was a perfect overview and also a perfect segue to the last round. One last question to the dear panelists here, namely, what is the recipe, in one sentence just, the recipe to creating greater financial resilience under the Global Shield? Vosita, just one sentence. What is your recipe now?
Evidence-based inclusive processes with means of implementation, especially finance.
Thank you. Gernot. Oh, we can't hear you. Probably you switched the microphone on.
Yeah, it's on.
Now it's working. It's working.
So I think we need to help governments make the transition from managing crisis to managing risks. And in order to do so, it's still one sentence, they need to answer the question, if I have $100 in my pocket, how much do I invest in community-based disaster risk reduction? How much do I invest in national systems for forecasting and early warning? How much do I put in insurance premiums? And how much do I keep behind for contingencies?
Fantastic. A very good recipe. Paola.
Yes. So I think it should be transparent, accessible, inclusive, and it should be well coordinated.
Very good. And Heike.
Yeah, thank you very much, colleagues. So one sentence, taking the risk seriously and act and manage it accordingly by being bold, ambitious, inclusive, and courageous.
Wonderful last words and a great recipe from all of you. Thank you so much, dear panelists. It was such an enriching discussion and so many concrete points to follow up with the Global Shield. I just want to say that there is more coming up on discussions in the global platform. There is a high-level discussion right after this event in 4 minutes time. It will start on strengthening disaster and climate risk governance at national and local level for accelerated progress. This will be also streamed online at the Global Platform's website, and even tomorrow there's a very interesting event on nature-based solutions on site, implementing nature-based solutions to reduce systemic risks. An event with Injury Resilience Global Partnership member from Karina Wally from AXA, and the event right after also with a representative from the German government talking about the Global Shield. Again, I thank you, especially also the panelists, again, the audience, the lively contributions you've made were great. Thank you so much, and have a lovely day, evening, wherever you are. And yeah, and I hope we can go ahead with the Global Shield and hear more soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Astrid.
Thank you, Astrid. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
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 Thank you for joining the session. And especially with a focus on Indonesia. Thank you.
4 minutes time. It will start on strengthening disaster and climate risk governance at national and local level for accelerated progress. This will be also streamed online at the Global Platform's website, and even tomorrow there's a very interesting event on nature-based solutions on site, implementing nature-based solutions to reduce systemic risks. An event with Injury Resilience Global Partnership member from Karina Wally from AXA, and the event right after also with a representative from the German government talking about the Global Shield. Again, I thank you, especially also the panelists, again, the audience, the lively contributions you've made were great. Thank you so much, and have a lovely day, evening, wherever you are. And yeah, and I hope we can go ahead with the Global Shield and hear more soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Astrid.
Thank you, Astrid. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
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 Thank you for joining the session. And especially with a focus on Indonesia. Thank you.